What's up, Texas basketball fam? Welcome to Keep Austin Beard. We're talking Texas hoops today. I think I can make the case that this is an Elite Eight contender. Ari thinks he can make the case that this is a Final Four contender. But before you watch, go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, so let's talk about Kansas first because that's what's on everybody's mind right now. Texas upset number 8 Kansas at home on Monday night. It was the rowdiest crowd I've ever seen at the Frank Irwin Center, and I went to school at UT, and I went to a lot of games, and that was the best environment that I've seen in that arena. And it was really impressive performance, impressive by the fans, and impressive by the coaching staff to get this win. So you watched Kansas all year this year as you are a Kansas grad. What did you see that interested you that Texas did? What did you think that they did that made it a game that they could pull the upset in?
Well, to echo your sentiment, I mean, I went to Kansas, as you mentioned, and then covered Texas in Austin as part of the 104.9 The Horn for about 3 years. And consistently, the environments at Irwin Center were terrible, like not even average to below average, but terrible. And I remember like my first, when I came from Kansas and then my first like Texas basketball season in Austin, it was like, well, maybe it'll pick up after football season. And then it just never picked up.
Right.
So what Chris Beard has done in a short period of time to engage a fan base is incredible. That was electric from start to finish the entire time. The consistency of the crowd was incredible, was fun. I mean, I'm excited to see what the Moody Center brings next year with all the bells and whistles and whatnot. It's going to be a place to want to be seen kind of thing, I think. But I think in advance of that, Chris Beard has done a fantastic job of creating a real college basketball environment in Austin, which in a short period of time, he's done incredible work. And that stood out to me more than anything else from the game itself. I mean, Kansas struggles defensively. They played much better on the defensive end of late. After the Kentucky loss, they dropped to like 51st or 52nd in the Ken Palm. And so now after a couple of games, Baylor and Texas, Baylor and somebody else, and then Texas, whatever, they're up to in the 30s now. So they're moving up. But this was a very physical basketball game. And they called a lot of fouls in the first half, but they really let them play in the second half. And I think that this is not the type of game that a Texas basketball team in the past would have won when both, because Bill Self's teams are always physical. When Texas can kind of push back a little bit like they did here and then win, it says a lot about this program where it is right now.
Yeah, I think it was interesting how they used Trey Mitchell in the first half. We were talking during the game about how Mitch Lightfoot, who's a forward for Kansas, was really struggling to guard Trey Mitchell. And the way to stop Trey Mitchell all year has been to A, trap him, and B, be physical with him. And Kansas wasn't really able to do either of those things effectively. So Trey didn't have a great game from the field. I think he finished 3 for 10. But what he did do was get to the free throw line early and often. He went 8 for 8 from the free throw line in the first half for 12 points. And that was a huge thing that got the Texas basketball team going, I think. I think it was good for their mentality of like, okay, we can pound it inside. We can get points this way. We can get to the free throw line early. And I wrote that in the pregame article, how important it was going to be for them to get to the free throw line. And they did that throughout the entire game. They finished 20 for 23 from the line. And not just getting to the line, but being effective from the line. That's something that's super important in the NCAA tournament going forward. And I think that's going to be a thing that separates them from other teams.
They also shot 19 more shots than Kansas in the game. So, I mean, I don't have Kansas shooting percentages in front of me, but Kansas shot like 58% from the floor. Something. I mean, they shot a really high percentage. So the fact that Texas didn't have to shoot that well is because they shot 19 more shots. And I remember earlier in the year, we talked about pace. I don't know where they currently are at pace. But that is, that's a huge number to shoot 20 more shots than your opponent in a game. That's huge.
Yeah. And if you look at the rebounding numbers, like Christian Bishop had 10 rebounds, but he had 7 offensive boards in that game. Kansas as a team had 6. So Christian Bishop, who is 6'7", out rebounded an entire team on the offensive end by himself. And he's just one of, I really focused on 3 players in this game that I think were the most important. Obviously, Timmy Allen, who scored 24 points. He was the leading scorer. So obviously him. Christian Bishop, who I just mentioned with his 7 offensive rebounds. And then Courtney Ramey. His defense on Ochai Agbaji was unbelievable. He was just denying him the ball the entire game. Ochai came in averaging just shy of 21 points per game, I think, something like that. And he only had 7 field goal attempts the entire game. So he had 11 total points. So Ramey was basically just face guarding him the entire time and just denying him the ball. And even in those last few possessions, he wasn't able to get the ball. I mean, Ramey just took him out of the game completely. And he may have been the MVP of the game just based off that performance by itself.
You're right. It's funny because you kind of watch the game and you're like, what's wrong with Ochai Agbaji? And then you're zeroing in on that and you're like, oh, wow, that's Chris Beard trusted Courtney Ramey to get the job done on a one-on-one situation with one of the best offensive players in the country. And then I think offensively, Andrew Jones was really, really good in the first half.
Yep.
Scoring from wherever he wanted, and then didn't really show up in the second half, but that was okay because Timmy Allen basically took over. So it was like a tale of 2 halves in terms of offensive production. Andrew Jones got them the first half production, and then Timmy Allen brought it home. He was just hitting everything down the stretch of that basketball game. Yeah,
Timmy Allen, I called him the mid-range madman because he was hitting every single shot. I mean, the shot that gave them the lead, which made it 77-76, was just a mid-range jump shot from the free throw line where Marcus Carr drove the ball. He was going downhill, ran into kind of a wall that Kansas had set up, and then he just kicked it right back. And Timmy Allen was there unguarded, and he just nailed the mid-range jumper. It was a super clutch shot. And he was doing that all game. He was really getting to his spots. It kind of reminded me, I'm not saying Timmy Allen is as good as Kawhi Leonard, but it reminded me of the way Kawhi Leonard gets to his spots and hits those mid-range jumpers. That's kind of the game he played. And he's just he was very aggressive throughout the game and getting to those spots and finding open looks. And he shot like a super high percentage. He wasn't inefficient at all. And he was just really dominant. He was 11 for 17 on the game. And I think you give him the MVP if you don't give it to Ramey.
Yeah. And I mean, now when I kind of look at the standings, so Kansas has 2 conference losses. Texas gets another opportunity with Kansas to close out the Big 12 slate on March 5th in Lawrence.
Yep.
Going for 4 straight against Kansas. By the way, this is the first time a Bill Self coach team had lost 3 consecutive games to a Big 12 opponent. 19 years. Never happened. That's incredible for Texas to do that. Hat tip Shaka Smart for 2 of those 3.
Right.
But I mean, so Kansas has 2 losses. Baylor has 3 losses in 1 more game.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got TCU, which is 5-4. So they play a lot less games.
Mm-hmm.
Texas has the 4 losses and Texas Tech has the 4 losses.
Right.
Texas is not out of this thing yet. This is a conference where there's going to be more upsets. I don't know if Kansas is going to end up losing 4 games, but they're going to lose more than 2. And so I think those 5 teams, and maybe TCU a little bit less TCU, but they're still in it because they only have 4 losses. But I don't know about you, but I still think Texas is very much in the thick of this conference race.
Yeah, I think this game against Baylor Saturday is going to determine a lot about the season going forward. But before I jump to Baylor, I did want to mention, so you were right, Texas gave up 58% shooting and 76 points to Kansas, but they forced 15 turnovers and only had 7 turnovers of their own.
58% and you 58%. Won. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, and in the post-game press conference, Bill Self said, if you told me before the game we were going to hang 76 on Texas, that's a good deal for us because they usually hold opponents in the early 50s.
Yeah, no, it was, but I mean, you double them up in turnovers, you get the offensive glass like they did, and then you double them up, had 20 more shots than Kansas, take 20 more shots than Kansas. There you go.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about this on my Big 12 radio show. We were talking about this kind of like, who are the legit Final Four contenders here? And I think you can make the case, obviously, for Kansas and Baylor. You can make the case for Tech. But I don't know, man. I kind of think that Texas is a little bit of a sleeping giant here. And I'll leave it up to Evan Mia, our buddy,
Right.
from evanmia.com. And, is it Mia or Maya?
It's Mayakawa is his last name.
Mayakawa. Thank you. Evan Mayakawa, evanmaya.com. And he brought this point up about like sometimes teams that are preseason hyped that end up disappointing a bit tend to then kind of find themselves a little bit at the end of the season, as if like we weren't wrong about some of these teams. Now you can make the case that Michigan's one of those teams, but I don't know that Michigan's anywhere near where they were expected to be. Texas is one of those teams.
Yeah.
And don't look now, but Texas is starting to find something on offense. And so when you couple that with what they have defensively, I mean, when you consider this defense just gave up 76 points and 58% shooting to Kansas and still won, that says a lot about their offensive potential. And so that's why, like, I honestly don't know that you can make a better case for any other team in the Big 12 to get to a Final Four beyond Texas. Kansas is not a good defensive team. I think they're a early exit team unless they could, really play a very good defense to end out the season. Texas Tech, lockdown defense. I like Texas's offense though, and firepower more than Texas Tech's.
Yep.
I'm not gonna even talk about TCU because I'm not going to. And then Baylor, if Baylor can't get LJ Cryer healthy, and James Akinjo has been a shell of himself for the last couple of weeks. He's come back from an injury, but like those two, that was the most dynamic backcourt in college basketball. If they can't find that again, Baylor's not a Final Four contender. So again, Texas to me, they've quietly sort of rounded into form here, especially on offense. And when you look at where they were preseason with expectations and where they are defensively, very quietly, I think this is a legit Final Four contender. And certainly when you factor in the other Big 12 teams, perhaps the most Final Four contender of all of them.
Yeah, I like all the points you made. I think it depends on, obviously with the tournament, so much of it depends on your draw and like where you end up, who's in your bracket. That's like the biggest part of it to me. But really quick, speaking of teams that were highly hyped preseason, fell off a little bit, rounding back into form, Arkansas.
Yep.
That's a team that pops up for me for that. I mean, they just pulled off an upset over number 1 Auburn.
Eric
but yeah,
took his shirt off and had a sling on.
What a ridiculous person that guy is, man. He's so good for the sport, though.
Yeah, you're right. That's good.
Yeah, no. Yeah, Arkansas is I think legit. JD Note is a star in the making for sure. Let's talk about Baylor though, because that's coming up on Saturday. That's going to be really, really indicative of where this Texas team is. I mean, you have the big home upset you pull off against Kansas. What can they do coming off that game to see where they stand in the conference? So a couple of things about Baylor. They're on a 9-man rotation, but it's going to depend on if Cryer plays because he's still questionable for that game. But they have Akinjo, Brown, Meyer, Flagler, Thamba. Is it Thamba? Thamba. And then they have Cryer, Sohan, Chamwa, Chachua, and Bonner coming off the bench. So they got blown out by Kansas recently, but I think people are starting to dismiss them already. And like what you said, the injuries have been a big factor there, but they're still 26th in offensive rating in the country and 15th in defensive rating, right? So they went to, I think they beat Kansas State last night by about 15, but the Big 12 is so brutal. I mean, OU beat Tech last night by 15, held them to 55 points. So you just never know. It's going to really be interesting to see how all of these teams do in the tournament to get a real indication of what this conference is. And I tweeted about this recently. As excited as I am for Texas to go to the SEC, I'm going to miss this round robin gauntlet of Big 12 basketball, man. Or the double round robin. It's really exciting. It's a really fun conference season because you just never know who's going to win which game.
Totally. I mean, we've seen some major upset, and that's why I go back to don't think the Kansas is going to run away with this conference here. There's still a chance for some of these 4-loss teams to get back in it because there's going to be some letdowns and disappointments. And you just motivations played a huge role. West Virginia had a big time win this week after having 7 consecutive losses.
Right.
So motivation there. And I mean, you've got teams like West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Iowa State
Right.
that were the darlings of the non-conference schedule that are now fighting for legitimate NCAA contention. Like Iowa State's last in the conference right now. They were 13-1 going into that game against Baylor to start conference play, or 13-0 to start conference play.
Yeah.
So it's kind of remarkable what's happened here. Like TCU wasn't very impressive coming out of non-conference play. They've turned it on. West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Iowa State are like, I don't know what to think of them. So yeah, you're right. It's been an interesting season. In terms of Baylor, it's kind of interesting because you'd think they'd have better guard depth with Flagler and Meyer. But Meyer, it's weird. He's an NBA player because he's got the size and shooting ability, and like he's got a lot of the traits that I think NBA teams like. Mm-hmm. But he's been, I think, a disappointment in terms of like being a key scorer night in, night out. So like because of that, they've relied so much on Akinjo and Cryer. And so that it's tested their depth. And that, I mean, you'd think they'd have better guard depth than they have, and they don't. The big thing is their defense. And they have, Thamba and Tchamwa Tchatchoua. They are electric in terms of rim protection. Tchamwa Tchatchoua had like 20 points last night. So forget about it.
8 for 9.
Yeah. If Tchamwa Tchatchoua gets 20 points, you're going to lose. Like forget about it. You can't have that guy go off like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, their front court is good, and that they're the reason that their defense is so elite. It just kind of comes down to the availability of Cryer and then Akinjo, who's again coming back from that knee injury that he missed some time with, and was held scoreless against Kansas in the 21-point blowout, or whatever it was, against KU. So.
Yeah, I think the reason that I think Texas might struggle in this game is like Texas Tech, Baylor is really athletic on the wing spot. And that's what gave Texas a ton of trouble against Texas Tech was their guards and Timmy Allen couldn't really get loose, couldn't get to their spots like they were able to against Kansas.
Kansas is not. In fact, Joseph Yesufu, who's a transfer from Drake, who's starting to play more, played well, and I think against Texas partly for that reason. He's a more athletic player, but they like DeJuan Harris down the stretch, and DeJuan Harris is not an athletic guard. So you're right. Kansas, that didn't really hurt Texas.
Yeah. And so just judging, I think Baylor and Tech are closer to each other than Kansas is to either of those teams, just in terms of personnel. I think it's going to depend on whether Texas. Oh, another thing Texas is going to have to do is rebound, because Baylor likes to throw multiple dudes on the offensive glass. They really like to try they call it blitzing, right? It's like in football, they send multiple dudes at the rim after a miss, try to get an offensive board and score. So I think for Texas, getting into transition is going to be huge for them, because that's how Kansas beat Baylor, really, is they were just throwing it into transition every time Baylor would crash the glass.
Yeah, it's a good call on the offense glass. But look, I think this is a game that I expect Texas to win this game. And you almost look at the defensive game plan, and like if you put Courtney Ramey on Akinjo and say like just do what you did to Ochai Agbaji, they're going to struggle to find scoring opposite Akinjo. So I wonder, and you can kind of afford, if you're Texas at this point, to because if you're telling Ramey, hey, give full effort on defense, you're not going to get much on offense, nor should you expect to.
Right.
But you have Jones, his emergence here as being like a primary scorer, Marcus Carr. And then of course the bigs that we know with Trey Mitchell and Timmy Allen and whatnot.
Right.
Maybe
and
that's the game plan for Chris Beard, just sort of duplicate what you did defensively against Ochai Agbaji on James Akinjo.
Yeah. And I think people sort of overrate Baylor's home court. I don't think it's like as crazy as it's definitely not Fog Allen. It's not United Supermarket Center. I think that's where Tech plays. Arena. Sorry. I don't think it's that level of home court, but I'll be there on Saturday so I can report back on how loud it actually is. But the thing is, whenever Texas plays anybody, they're getting the crowd involved because everybody hates Texas. It's like Marcus Carr said that in a post-game press conference. He was like, Texas is the most hated team in the conference and maybe in the country. And I think he's right. Yeah,
there's a lot. I mean, Texas just as a brand is polarizing. So it doesn't matter what the sport is. I mean, we talk about this. You see horns down on random games that have nothing to do with Texas.
Nothing to do with Texas at all.
It's just like just a thing people like to do. There was like a Big East game I saw
right.
Like what?
Yeah. Shout out to my buddy Joe Cook, who does a bit on Twitter. Whenever he sees something, he goes, "We have horns down in whatever arena."
Right. Like, okay.
So funny.
It's so weird.
It is weird. All right. That'll probably do it for us today. I appreciate you, Ari. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And Texas plays at 11 a.m. again at Baylor on Saturday, and I will be there. So looking forward to that game, and appreciate you, Ari.
Appreciate you, brother.